Welcome everyone to the Sitecore Pittsburgh user group. Today we are going to deep dive Docker with Jammykam. I'm pretty excited for this one. The sponsor for the meeting would be CEI, which is where I work. Some information about them. As always, join the Slack community. Be active on the community. There are a lot of people to help there. When you start with Docker, there's everyone. We have a separate Docker channel. Feel free to throw your questions there, and people are there to help. And I will hand it over to Jamie.
All right, thanks everyone for joining. So today we're going to talk about Docker and using Sitecore with Docker. So a little bit about myself. My name is Kamruz Jaman. I'm a partner over at Konabos. We're a specialist Sitecore consultancy. I've been doing Sitecore for over 10 years and the Sitecore MVP for the past 8 years. So we're just going to go over, so the agenda for the session is we'll go over some information about what we're trying to solve, what Docker is, how you guys can get started using Docker, how you can use Sitecore and Docker in a bit of a real life situation. I have a sample project which I've taken and I'll give you the links to that at the very end. We'll go through some tooling and some debugging because that's probably the biggest issue, was trying to figure out how you use your existing tooling, how that relates to Docker. And I think looking at some of that tooling really helps ease your mind. And then throughout the session, I'll point out a couple of gotchas that caught us out when we were starting with Docker as well. So the biggest question is, why Docker? What are we trying to solve by moving away from what we currently have our setup? You know, we're all used to using Sitecore throughout the various versions, using our regular set of tooling, right? You know, we're told it's just another .NET application. You can just deploy it to your local machine, and then you just work with it like you would any non-Sitecore .NET application. But Sitecore is a bit special in that regard, right? The installation process over the years has become more and more tricky. Sitecore 6 was just a few little databases that you just throw into IIS. Sitecore 7 brought in Mongo, or Sitecore 8, should I say. And then as it's grown, it's becoming more and more tricky. Developer setup, as a result, does take a while longer, and especially if you're in an agency type situation where you're working with lots of different customers, you end up with a lot of different installs of Sitecore, and it gets very, very messy very, very quickly on your local machine. Front-end developers as well. We tend to steer front-end developers away from Sitecore and using their own static sets of tooling, whether that's in a separate repo or however that thing is. The setup is difficult enough for .NET developers that we just like, you guys stay away from this completely and don't worry about the Sitecore side. We'll integrate that, right? Repeatable deployments is another thing on a local machine. We tend to just have Sitecore deployed, and we just deploy it over and over and over and over the same instance with the same sets of databases and whatever else that thing may be. So along with repeatable deployments is clean environments, right? Like I said, we are not starting from clean environments each time we deploy, whereas our production environments may well be, hopefully at least, from a clean stance. Upgrades and updates are also problematic. If you upgrade from, say, Sitecore 9.2 to 9.3, and you have 10 team members, then that's a lot of upgrade time on every single team member's machine. So we try to reduce that that cycle of the upgrade. So as I mentioned, Sitecore over the years has become bigger and more monstrous and frustrating at points, where you end up having to pull your hair out. A lot of different services to manage, a lot of different moving parts now. Even myself as a veteran Sitecorean, it's a bit tricky. Even I find it hard to keep track of all the moving parts, and we've become quite reliant on SIF to just do its thing in the that developer setup script. Trying to work that back as well if you need to uninstall. There's lots of little things to kind of look at and try and pull apart. So we get into Docker, and so the first thing is like, what is Docker, right? Because it's a bit of a buzzword, and you kind of read a little bit about it, and it's like, okay, it sounds cool, but it also kind of sounds a little bit complicated, right? But what are we trying to do with this thing? I think we've all kind of used something like Docker in the past. I think a lot of us have worked with virtual machines. Hopefully, at least you have, whether that's locally or in environments. I worked at agencies where we would have a virtual machine per client, per project, right? So you start working on a new project, you spin up a virtual machine, you turn it down, you offload it onto some some other storage, and then you're bringing backwards and forwards onto your local machine as you need. And the whole point of that was, separation, right? So you have this ring-fenced environment for each different client, and you get this cross-bleed of projects, and it also helps to track dependencies that you're installing and would need in further environments. But the difference with virtual machines, what you're usually doing is you're virtualizing the hardware and then installing your whole environment within that. With Docker, what you're actually trying to do is virtualize the software, and then virtualize the operating system, and then build your software on top of that. So instead of installing a virtual machine, it's on your host machine, which already has Windows, you install a virtual machine, install Windows within that, and then you put your software on top. With Docker, what you're doing is you're taking a base set of images, which would share some resources with your local machine, and then you're deploying your actual application within that. So you're not worrying about the operating system so much, that's kind of shared, but you're still trying to have this containerized separate application. So we've all kind of used Docker, a heavier version of Docker in the past, and the concepts are not that dissimilar. Docker builds up using layers. This isn't that different than how you would generally install software. So you have on your local machine, you have Windows, you have IIS on that, you'd install SQL Server on that, and then you'd install Sitecore, and then you'd install the SPE module, and then on top of that you'd install the SXA module, and then on top of that you'd install whatever other modules you want. You're building these up in layers. But in Docker, you're explicitly building these things up in layers over different image sets. And I'll show you that a bit later. But it's built up in like small little units of work almost. So Sitecore and Docker. So what's all that about, right? Let's go back here. So this is something that has been built up by the community over the past few years. It's hosted on the Sitecore GitHub repo, but it is a community effort. It's just been brought together by some of the Sitecore members at Sitecore themselves. Instead of having lots of separate little community projects, let's bring them all back together and work on this as a group, as a community. So what they've done is they've taken, somebody has spent, or a group of people have spent a lot of time, and they've gone out and they've defined what those Sitecore base images should be. And they're a really good starting point for us to be able to pull down this repo, build some images, and get Sitecore up and running in Docker without having to write all of the files that define what those layers are. But you can obviously go in and look at what they've done and extend that as you need. So if you want to get started, install Docker Desktop. That's a prerequisite. That's going to be required, obviously. Clone the repo from this GitHub repo. Build the images. Set your local license file, and then you can run Docker. It's a couple of simple commands. I'll show you that in a few minutes. So it doesn't seem that hard, but when you're going through this, it's obviously it's a new set of technology, so it's going to be a bit more tricky. So this is where your first gotcha will come in when you install Docker. Make sure you got Hyper-V enabled. So that's a Windows feature. Just head on over to your Windows features and just make sure that these Hyper-V settings are enabled. Make sure it's also enabled in your BIOS. It generally is enabled, but we had a couple of team members where it wasn't enabled in their BIOS, and guess what? It didn't work because Hyper-V was unenabled, right? And the message isn't that clear when you go to run it that that's what it is. Also take note of your Windows version. So just head on over to your Windows settings, and then pull up the system information, and then you'll see some the specification. So when they talk about Windows version in relation to Docker, it's usually to do with this Windows specification and this version number, and not the edition. The edition is not so important. And you should try and match whatever version of Docker you're running on your local machine to the one on your local machine. And I'll become a bit more clear when we go through this. So once you've cloned the repo, the first thing you're going to want to do is to build the images, right? So head on over. In the root, there's a build.ps1 file. The base set of commands is build.ps1, pass in your Sitecore username and password. This is your SDN username and password. What it will do in the background is when this runs, it will download the packages that it needs to run the build itself. All the zip files and module packages and that kind of stuff. You can pass in some extra flags as well with your build scripts. Include SPE, include SXA, include JSS if you also want those images built. I recommend that you build them if you more than likely won't need them, especially with SPE and SXA. So you might as well just go ahead and build them right now. You can also include experimental, so that includes things like Horizon, I believe, and the publishing service. They're marked as experimental, so if you want those ones, also put those in. You can also pass skip existing if you've already had some images built. So if you previously built some images without the SPE, SXA flags, and then you want to go and build the SPE and SXA flags, pass that in. It will skip rebuilding images that already exist in your local machine. You can also specify the Sitecore versions, topology and OS version, which I just mentioned. Should have been 2004. But 9.3, 9.2 are the latest sets. You can build earlier versions. It's within a legacy folder set, so that uses a different build script. But if you're just starting out, most of us will probably just use this 9.2 and 9.3. XP, SC, XM topologies, these are all valid arguments that you can pass in. And you can also pass in these registry settings, right? Registry username and password. These are entirely optional. If you don't pass those in, it will build it to your local machine or local registry. If you pass those in, it can push those up to a shared internet registry, right? If you do pass those in, make sure it's a private repository and not an open public one. Obviously, Sitecore is licensed software, so you don't want to be pushing that up into the public repo and get in trouble from the legal department. So what images are built? So there's an XM set, which will do the CM and the CD. There's the XP sets based on the flags that you pass in. And then there's the XC set, the experience commerce as well. And then based on those additional include flags, it will start to layer up and build the SPE, SXA, JSS. It will build up some CMs, some CD sets, it will add in the identity, XConnect. It's quite a comprehensive set of images that it builds up. Our current project, we are running, what I regard as the highest tier, so it'd be experience commerce with the storefront components. So it's like everything, right? It's the full Sitecore stack. But previously we've run just XP, well, XP with SP as a minimum, because why wouldn't you run PowerShell, right? So it's super easy. So the scripts will build up a whole host of images, and then it's up to you to decide how you want to push that stuff up. As I mentioned, by default, it will build the images to your local machine, which is a great way to get started. You can play around with them. It does take a long time to build the images. So even on a powerful machine, I'd say at least 3 to 4 hours. So the more you build, the longer it's going to take, obviously, especially the first time. So do allow a lot of time for those images to be built. If you are building multiple Windows versions, so 1809, 1903, 1909, now 2004, which is the latest Windows update. You're doubling, tripling, quadrupling the build time because you're building more and more and more sets of those images. So first time you build them, do allow some time. If you're building them locally, just build it to whatever your local Windows machine is, because you're not going to want to spend that time on images you don't really care about. But I do recommend creating a Azure container registry or a container registry somewhere. We're currently running one in Azure, and it's costing us about $20 a month. It's super cheap, right? So once you go into Azure, you can create a container registry, and then you'll build the images or push them up. It'll push all of those images up. And if I pick up the XP standalone, that's it. But I'll do the SP standalone. So you can see I've got two sets of images built here. One is LTSC 2019, which is the 1809 build of Windows, and then 1909. But you can see I've got a whole host of images built up here, including XC. It's not costing us more than $20 a month, and I believe we have plenty of, I've used 30 gigs for the full stack of 2 sets of versions of Windows, so still have plenty of space in there. That's just for 9.3. If you're running in an agency, then you'll probably push up all the versions that you can up onto here. So running your containers, I'll just run through before I do that, I'll just go through, jump ahead. I'll just go through the repository from GitHub for the Docker images. See there, let me just pull that up. So I mentioned the build.ps1. That's just straight in the root folder. And again, you can see all of those parameters that I mentioned earlier. This is a slightly older download, but the newest one has 2004, which is the latest Windows update. again, so that was the OS version. You can just pass in whatever value that you want in there. This build script will build any of these versions of Sitecore. There are some older versions in the legacy branch, so you can see there's some 7.5, 8.2, or again all the way up to 9.20. The build scripts have been updated, the images have been updated, just as more and more people have been contributing to these. You can still build the old ones; they'll still work. Or you can pull them down and make whatever modifications you want. But it's a pretty full set. I think that should hopefully cover most people's needs for the current projects that we're working on. So you just need to pass this down. This will then go through, run a bunch of commands. You can follow it through. It boils down to it running some standard sets of Docker commands. It looks like it's doing a lot. It's a very clever script, but it abstracts away so much that it does make things probably seem like magic. But it does go into this module, Sitecore Image Builder, invoke build, right? So it's going in. If you check the commands, this will output what it's actually running, and it's just running standard Docker commands, right? The documentation for Docker is very, very good, but obviously it takes a while to figure out what all the things are that you need to run. But if you are interested, you can. It does write out the messages. Just set the verbosity when you're running the build command, and it will output those. So you can compare those. You can reverse engineer and look up what those commands are doing or what those things are doing. So as I mentioned, it will go through, and then within the Windows folders, there's you kind of need to jump around a little bit. But within the Windows folder, so the 93X, you'll see layers of images. So PS is publishing service. So Sitecore XP, this would be the base that most of the other layers would build on top of. So Sitecore XP, and then XPX Connect. Then within the 93XX, you'll see a Sitecore SXA, and you'll see that all of these are just building on top of the other ones. So the Docker repo, if you have a look in here, you have a Docker file and a build.json. The build.json is like a set of variables that are passed into the Docker file. The Docker file itself is what defines the build for that image. So here we can see we've got a base image, which is just a Microsoft one, a Windows Server Core, ASP.NET, right? 4.8 ASP.NET. We've got some other variables that we're passing in. And then in the Docker file itself, we take our base image, and then we do some stuff to it. The stuff being, we grab some assets, we expand some packages, we tell it to do a bunch of things. So in this case, we're telling it to, initially we're telling it to expand an archive, copy the files to the init pub www root folder. We're telling it to copy a bunch of disabler files. In this case, it's the identity server. And we're just building it up, right? One by one, we're just telling it, do this, do this, do this, do this. And it's not any different than if you were manually setting this up on your local machine, right? You'd take the zip, you'd unzip it, you'd put it into the init pub folder, you'd maybe enable and disable a bunch of configs. You might set some other, you might run some transformations, right? So here we're telling it to run a bunch of transformations for that machine. Might apply some additional patches, and then just one by one, we're doing a bunch of stuff. And in the end, we're actually then going ahead and binding a bunch of things and doing some stuff in IIS, right? Setting up our sites and whatever else. And then if we have SXA on top of that, so we take our SXA Docker file. So this is in the SXA layer. and that one's gonna use as its base. So as its base image, we're going to use a Sitecore XP with SPE this time, because SP is required as a base for as a base for SX8. And then again, and then with the same kind of thing, we run another set of commands, and the Docker file will, when it runs its build, will take this build file and then again just run top to bottom and run these commands, and just one thing by one thing. It's just building up those little layers, adding those files, renaming this, changing this, right? So along with the SXA, along with the actual web part of the build, there's obviously a number of other things. There's some stuff happening in the background around XConnect and stuff, for example, and identity and whatever else. But we'd also have a matching SQL red. So with the SXA SQL, we'll have a build file, which will take a base image. In this case, it's the SQL version of the SPE build that we built earlier from our other layer. And then again, it will run this Docker file. And in this case, it's going in, it's taking a bunch of modules, extracting them, and then using some scripts to extract a database and install a database. And these install and extracts right there. But in this case, it's taken an SCWDP, so the extracts those, takes the files in the web part of it, extracts out the DAC pack. These scripts here will attach a database, run that DAC pack, and make whatever SQL changes that it needs to add. In this case, the SXA package, the SPE one will do something similar, and so on and so forth. So it's just building up layer by layer, saying, okay, take this, attach a database, run the DAC pack. Now, and then package those up and put that into the container and do any cleanup that you need to do. Again, you can, if you needed to, you can add additional layers on top of these. So take whichever one of these you want. So we take some of the SXA ones, for example, when we add an additional layer, a custom layer, to add our own sets of modules. We're using Coveo on our current project, so again, we need to add Coveo into our base project. We've got a couple of other custom modules that we're using. Again, we just essentially copied one of these, added our own build.json, and started from whatever the minimum base we can get away with, and then just have a Docker file which will go ahead and run whatever commands we need to extract and add additional files, set whatever variables that we need to set. So it's quite complicated. Dive into this, have a little play, but the build.ps1 is where you're going to really want to start. Once you've got the you're going to go into this folder, and within this test folder is where you have a bunch of these compose files. These compose files are what we use to bring up our set of services. I'll jump into that in a second. So what you would do is in the PowerShell elevated PowerShell window, you go up, you run Docker compose with -f, and then whatever the image set name is. So if I want to run the XP SXA, I pass in Docker compose XP SXA YAML up, and then use a /d, which will set it to a non-interactive mode. We'll pick out from things from that image container, so it's a little bit annoying. You don't really need it because the logs are available for Docker dashboard. And once you're done, run Docker compose down. That will bring the containers down and just do a bit of a cleanup. If you don't want to pass -f and the image file name, rename whatever you use into Docker compose.yaml. So if I rename this to Docker compose.yaml, and then just within this this folder, I just run Docker compose up -d. It will use whatever that is as a default file naming. It can also be set in the environment file. I'll point that just bring that up. If you have an environment file, see, I think there is, yeah, there is one here. If you have an environment file like so, you can just add in a variable like so. This isn't in the standard one. You can just add in a variable like this, and then you don't need to rename it. For most people, you'll probably just be using a single compose file. It doesn't really matter, but it's I think it's a useful thing to know depending on your team setup. I will go into this compose file in a second. This is coming up. Yeah, I'll go into this compose file in a second. You can set environment variables, so these are shared values across your project for your Docker to bring your Docker instance up in this environment variable. So I've got one set here, which is my registry setting. The default out of the box one is empty, which will mean you'll use your local one. Your levels I've got it set to match my local Windows one. I think the out of the box one is LTSC 2019. But yeah, change it to whatever value matches your local Windows version. So like Sitecore license setting, if you're attaching the Sitecore license via a mount, I'll point that out because I think Bala had an issue with this. There's a SQL password. We'll come back to that in a second. There's some Telerik encryption key pass setting. And there's an isolation mode, which is the process. You can add whatever values you want in here, transposes into the compose files. But what we are doing with these values is if you open up the compose file, you'll see these placeholders in there. So essentially, when I'm running my Docker compose up, these values will just get replaced into the placeholders. So our container registry, so this is actually from our custom private root. Our version is 9.3.0. You can have 9.2.2, 9.1.1, whatever you to match your local one. And then our Windows Server core version. Now, if you take this value and then you look at what I had in that container registry. Let's pull this one up. You'll see that those tags actually start to match up with what we had. So the container registry, Sitecore XP, C in this case, and then Sitecore version, so that's 9.3.0, Windows Server Core, and then the Windows Server version, all from 1909 here. So it's just doing these replacements for the values, which then builds up this string and tells it where to grab this image from. Other things like the SQL, it passes that into the Docker container as an environment variable, and then when the container starts up, it will mount that as password, as your REST password. And it's just doing that for a registry. It seems a little bit cryptic when you're looking at it, but when you actually look at it a bit more closely, it's just doing variable replacement. So any of you that have done any continuous integration, continuous deployment work will know this from whatever configs and stuff that you've used and done variable replacements when you're doing deployments and promoting up environments and that kind of stuff. So feel free to add these yourself. You can add whatever you like. We've got a number of them. So our environment files generally look like this. We've got a bunch of stuff in here like compose project name, the compose file, which I told you about, the main suffix, is all custom variables. But to build them from scratch, you don't need to worry about any of this stuff. And so, how's this any different? Like, what's the development workflow like compared to how it works when we set up on our local machine? It's a little bit different, but it's not really that much different. You still use your same set of tools. You still use Visual Studio. You still use SQL Server Management Studio if you want to use that. You can also even use IIS management to attach to a remote IIS instance. What you don't have is a local instance of SQL Server, a local instance of IIS, and a local instance of whatever other bits of software that you need. Everything is running within the container itself. Your container, I don't have on this machine, I don't have IIS or SQL Server installed. I've got the tools installed, but I don't have the actual services installed. I think the thing that I had a little bit trouble getting my head around is, well, how does this thing actually work? Where are the files when I'm deploying? Where is the SQL files? How do I connect to these things? It's just a little bit different because you're running this virtualized bit of software, this containerized software, and then you're kind of deploying into that. So it's almost like you're deploying to a kind of like a production environment, and then you're connecting, if you need to do anything, you're connecting remotely into another instance, another virtual machine type instance. One thing you have to be a bit careful about is that the Docker containers are volatile. So when you start an instance and then you do something within the instance, let's say you create a bunch of files or you rename a bunch of things, and then when you go to stop, when you do a Docker compose down, and then you start up again, it's like, oh, what happened to my files? Where did they go? It's every time you start Docker up, it starts up from clean, right? So if you've done something within the Docker instance, it gets destroyed every time you hit down, which is bad for when the first time you're running it, because you're like, what happened to all my stuff? But from a deployment workflow point of view, it's actually really good, because every time you start an instance up, you've got a brand new clean instance without all of that historical things that you've deployed and dumped into. But that kind of leads to questions like, well, I need my databases and that kind of stuff, right? I still want to keep those things. I don't want to have to redeploy every single time I start the instance back up, for example. And that's where volume mounts come in. So the volume mounts will map a folder from your local machine into the Docker container itself, and then you're kind of sharing data in a kind of two-way process between both of these things. So your SQL would be writing within the Docker container, but it will then just copy to your local machine. So the next time you start up your Sitecore instance or your Docker instance, it's reusing those same sets of databases that you had before, so you're not having to do a brand new deployment every single time. And it goes with a lot of the code. The log files, for example, is another good example, right? You'll want to keep some of those log files around for analysis or whatever, without it being destroyed every time you do a Docker contain down. So one thing to be careful with is with these mounts, you'll need to specify these mounts on disk. So within our Helix examples folder, I'll share this. I've got a link to this repo. I've got a Docker folder, and then I've got a data folder. These are some mounts that I've specified that I need. If you're gonna specify these and you're gonna wanna then check these in, because your other team members are going to want to keep these things as well. Right? I'm going to want these as well. So you have to, these have to exist. If you just specify them as a mount within your compose file, they won't just magically get created. But if you want to check them into Git, make sure you got some sort of file in there. So a Git keep or Git something works, or a README or whatever. If you don't have this and then you try to check this in, Git will not check in empty folders. It's just a function of Git to not check in empty folders, right? So just be a bit careful of that. We've created a couple of mounts sometimes, checked it in, and then one of the teammates is like, "Where's that folder? This mount is this compose is failing because of a missing mount." We specify that within the file itself. I'm going to bring up a compose file from the project that I got running. So within this compose file, we have our CM. We have. I'll start this one from the top. So I talked about the image and where it's picking that up from. So that's my SQL service. I also need a Solr. I need some XConnect stuff, and I need a bunch of XConnect stuff. I need a CM, and then I need an identity in this one. And then for the different layers, you're going to want different things, right? So for the commerce stuff, I'm going to want a bunch of commerce-related things in there. Again, all I'm doing is I'm specifying the image to use for each service, what entry point scripts to use, I'll talk about it in a second, and then the volume mounts, right? So this is how the data is being shared from within the Docker container to your local instance. So I need to specify where that exists on my local host machine and where to mount that within the Docker container itself. So this C source is the location inside of the Docker container. You can see I've got one for logs. I've got one for Unicorn as well as a and those are just mapping to startup, CM www root, and then C Unicorn is to the examples, Helix Basic Unicorn source, right? So that's how those mounts are working. So you're specifying on the left-hand side of the semicolon, you're specifying where the local folder path is, and that can be either relative or absolute. It could be C/ my project / Unicorn, for example. And then on the right-hand side, it's the mount within the container folder itself. So I mentioned this gotcha. These mounts, the ones on the left-hand side, have to exist locally. The ones on the right-hand side, it doesn't matter. They will just get created within the container itself, but they must exist locally. The other thing that we found was deleting files. So if I go into this folder, my same folder, and then I've got my www root folder. If I go and drop in a file in here, it doesn't matter. I'm just gonna copy a file over from here. If I go and copy this file over, this file will get copied to the default mount works by www root maps to C source. But the IIS instance within the container sits within inetpub www root. There is a script called watch directory, and you can find that within the assets and Sitecore assets and tools entry points script folder. There's a watch directory script. What that does is when I drop a file into this folder here, it copies it into C source within the mount, and then that watch directory folder actually copies it from this folder to this folder because then it maps to IIS. But the watch directory folder is quite literal and a little bit dumb, maybe you want to say, but I guess it's just the way it works. So if I go and create a folder file in here, I put this into /Sitecore, and I created this file in here. That's fine, that'll create that. And if I go, I delete that, the watch directory will just say, oh, okay, he's deleted that file, let me delete that within the container. Okay, that's kind of fine. And then I go, okay, actually, that folder's empty, so let me delete that. So what the watch directory script does is it mimics that exact action, and it goes, okay, in that case, let me delete, he's just deleted that folder, so let me delete that folder. And then guess what happens? It deletes the Sitecore folder within the container. Not a big deal, just stop your instance and start it back up.
Hey, Jamie, sorry to interrupt. I think the voice is breaking. Is it just me or everybody else is facing the same issue?
Just put that in the chat. It's happening to me too.
Yeah.
It actually sounds like that in real life.
Not much, but is it just breaking up on? Is it quiet or is it just the internet?
It might be the internet. It's kind of like a robot voice every once in a while. Like the connection is bad.
Is it okay at the moment?
Right now, it's okay.
Okay. Yeah, sorry guys, might be the internet. There's a lot of people at home these days.
Don't blame the internet.
Maybe if you want to turn off your video, it might help your bandwidth.
Sure. Yeah, let's do that.
What? My video?
Get just a lovely face. Let's see how I do that.
We're gonna miss you anyway.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
All right. And the other thing to watch out for is entry point scripts. They just define what happens when you bring your containers up. So they're defined here for each service. So this is the default one. You can customize them. I've got one here which is mapped to C startup, and as you can see, C startup is a folder, is a volume mount here. So just keep a watch on both of these. You shouldn't really need to do anything, especially for a local development one, but it allows you to add some additional functionality if you want to do something when custom when your Docker containers are spun up. Now I've done a lot of talking and a lot of screen. So before I do that, let's jump over to this project. So what I've done is I took the Helix examples project, right? This was the new Helix 2.0 project that Nick Wesselman had written up, which Nick Wesselman had created. And I made it run in Docker, right? So the default project has a bunch of scripts in here, which, it's to help new developers set up their local instances when they're trying to see what all this Helix business is about. And it installs it as you would expect on your local machine or local IIS and local SQL Server, etc. Right? Solr and all the other bits and services that come up. I forked that, and it's in the Konabos repo. The link is here. The link is at the end of the demo on the last slide, so you can copy it from there. And what I did is we've got a bunch of scripts in here, and so I'm just going to go in and run start. And I'll run through what the start script does, but this will just essentially just compose up and a Docker instance locally. And if you take a look at my local Docker dashboard, as that's spinning up, you'll see it'll start to add these services that were defined in the compose file. And then one by one, it will bring it up. It will not bomb out. And while that's running. So what I did is I took that repo, I done a couple of edits, just checked for the file edit history, but I changed the location of the Unicorn source folder, so it's C Unicorn. I mounted that. When you're running Unicorn with Docker, you need to remember that this config is deployed to inside the container. So even though I might have this locally as even though locally my folder path is mapped to examples source. I then also changed the publish URL. So it was publishing via some config replacements to your inet pub folder. And I've got this to publish to the Docker folder, right? So from the location in here to CM and then www root. I haven't done anything with this so far. Just wait for that to spin up. Okay, so my Docker instance is now up and running. If I open up my Docker dashboard, I can see it's all green. I've got a Helix example site running. If you're using Docker dashboard, you can do things like use these commands to actually open in the browser, start, etc. So at the moment, this should be just a very clean instance of Sitecore. And if I go to CM, go Helix examples, and then just run that, and then I just got to wait for Sitecore to now warm up, right? So I don't have IIS running locally. I don't have SQL Server running locally. This is all purely with using Docker on this particular machine. So Sitecore being Sitecore, it's going to take a little bit of time. While it's doing that, the only other thing I've done here is actually deployed a live mode config and a couple of configs to enable the identity server. You don't need to enable the identity server, but if you're running commerce and stuff, then you probably would. And depending on your production environment, you probably would want that as well. But the base set of images, disable it just to make it a bit easier and less services to get up and running. The other thing that the main stuff that I've done is I deleted a bunch of the out-of-the-box setup scripts because we don't need it, right? There's probably the majority of the work was just deleting a bunch of files. We don't need those. And then I've got a Docker folder. I've got my mounts just within this data folder. They're just pretty much empty folders which are required to create these volume mounts. And then I've got 4 compose files in here. Normally, for most projects, you just have the Docker compose.yaml, and that's all you really care about. I've got 4 just for demo purposes. They pretty much do the same thing. We've extended these a little bit from the ones from the community repo, just because we needed to do things like add the volume mounts because the community ones don't have that on there. We wanted a custom startup script, so I've got some scripts in here which will attach a SSL certificate. It needs to mount that to the IIS instance within Docker, for example, right? And there's a couple of other things. I've got some the domain suffix, which I mentioned earlier, to allow us to have a cm.helixexamples.local. And there's not really much else. We haven't really modified a huge amount else. We've got some stuff like allowing additional variables to set like different memory limits for each of the containers, for example. Take a look. You can take a look through those, and then I've got a couple of scripts in here which will. You just saw I just run a start.ps1, which all that's doing is it's running Docker Compose, right? I've got some additional stuff in here to allow per user environment variables. So I can then have, for example, I'm running 1909. Barlow was talking earlier that he's running the latest version of Windows. So this will allow us to have different versions of different variables per user, right? So it's a .user file. It's ignored by default Git settings, and then you can edit whatever things that you want. Set a different compose file. So if you have a front end developer working, maybe he can run XP, whereas the other team members need XC. So it really will depend on a team by team basis and a team member by team member basis. But there's just a couple of things that this .user file will allow you to do. And then we're running Wales names. Wales names is a NPM package which will find that. Which will it will synchronize your Docker IP addresses into your local host file. There's a couple of different ways of doing this. There's a couple, different community members are using different ways of doing it, but NPM works. It will look at the IP addresses of your Docker instances and then just write that into your local host file, which will then allow you to use user-friendly names such as this cm.helixexamples.local in this particular case, right? There's a couple of other scripts in there as well. So there's a stop. That doesn't do anything too clever, just does a Docker Compose down. We've got one to restart the Docker service because every so often it will decide that it's not going to play too nicely, so it just needs a bit of a restart. And then the other one in here is clean data. We've modified this one to use Git to do its clean, and I've also have it with a flag to ignore the SQL databases. So sometimes I just want to clean the files that I've deployed and not destroy my databases. Sometimes I do want to destroy everything and start completely from scratch again. I'll show you this script because this is like this way of working with being able to actually destroy your local instance and not care is like one of the nicest things about Docker, apart from all the niceties of setup. Let me go back to, okay, so my instance is up and running, so I can go in, got this bound to an SSL certificate locally and within the container. Again, if you're running out of, if you're just downloaded the out of the box, if you've just built the images from the community repo, it will be localhost 44001 or something like that. So this is a kind of an additional top, but I will share the repo URL if you want to do that. So you will need to obviously just wait. I still haven't deployed any code. You notice this will just be a clean instance of Sitecore. While that's doing its thing, we can just go to the content editor. And I'll just go back to that data folder. If we go in here into SQL folder, you'll see that all of these MDF and LDF files are now on my local machine. Going back to those mounts, the reason it's at the local machine is because for our SQL service, we had defined this volume mount for data SQL, and then within the Docker instance, it's within the data folder itself. So if you go through those install database, extract database scripts again, you'll see that that's where the default out-of-the-box databases are copied to. There's some stuff in the startup script as well, which keeps an eye on this. And that's the thing that allows us to persist our data. So when I shut down my Docker instance, these files are locally available to me on my host machine. When I start up again, it will look in this folder and then say, is there any LDF, MDF files in here? If there is, then attach these databases. If there isn't, then attach a brand new, clean, fresh set of databases. You'll get the same with Solar as well. There's these indexes in here, right? So next time I stop and start, it will just reuse these indexes. If I want to completely clean my instance, get a new set of databases, get a new set of indexes, I stop my Docker instance, and then I run this clean data command, and that will go ahead and delete all the scripts. So this is using Git. The community one is using pure PowerShell to do its clean. You use whatever version works for you guys. So you can see I've got a clean version of Sitecore in here. There's nothing in here. Now, the other script I have in here is a deployment script. The Helix Examples project uses the Helix Publishing project. What this does is it collects up all the feature project, foundation projects, and then using this single project as a gateway, you can go ahead and then publish that project. I have this, you probably can't see that too well, but that's C code, Helix, examples, Docker, data, CM, www root, right? You hit publish, and then you'd log onto the site, and then you'd hit the unicorn.aspx to do a sync. The other script I have in this example project is a deploy script. So just hit that. The script will go through, build that project, go ahead, and then it's published that project, and then it will run a unicorn sync. So at this point, if we go to our data, CM, www root folder, you'll see that I've actually got some files that have been deployed in here now. So I've got my basic company, feature, foundation, project, unicorn stuff in here, some views in here. So it's then gone ahead and done its deployment. So this deployment is no different than when you're publishing to your local inet pub folder, right? I have an inet pub folder in here, as you can see. So it's no different to just copying this, except you don't have all of the Sitecore base installed in here. You don't have to worry about this cross-contamination of my files and Sitecore's files, and how do I clean this and how do I clean that, right? Everything is, if you make a mistake, we've all done it, where we go ahead and install a package, and with the olden days, you install, you were meant to install the no references package, and you installed the regular package, and then it brings in a whole bunch of other Sitecore DLLs, and you deploy, and you're like, oh man, I was supposed to install Sitecore 8.2, but I installed Sitecore 9.3 package by mistake, because that's what NuGet picks by default. And then you're having to restore an old zip file. You don't have to worry about that. Worst case here, bring down your Docker instance, delete all of these files here, and then just start Docker back up, right? As soon as you start Docker back up, it will spin up a brand new clean image again, and then run whatever it's going to do like you would any normal point. So at this point, it would copy this into C source within the Docker instance itself, and then from C source, it'd copy it to C init pub www root inside of the Docker instance itself. Okay, so my deploy script is running. You can see it's kicking off. It's running a Unicorn sync. The deploy script is here. Again, it's not doing anything overly clever. It's taking a project. It's then invoking MS build. Invoking MS. It's great. It's generating an MS build expression. It downloads NuGet. It restores the NuGet packages, and then it invokes an MS build expression, calling my project, the website project, telling it to build and deploy using the local publish project. So it's not doing anything different than if I had just run it manually. It then goes ahead and calls a Unicorn sync using the sync tools. These are downloadable from the Unicorn Git repo. I didn't write these. These are already there. The only thing I've done is that I've included it as part of my project and as part of the build. Again, I could just go to /unicorn.aspx and run that command, but you get a bit lazy. Now I can just run start to bring up my my Docker instance, and then just run deploy to run the other command. Highly recommend you guys download Windows Terminal. This is running Windows Terminal. Allows you to have nice things like tabs, so you're not having lots of different PowerShell windows open. So that should be syncing. If I now open a new window and then just wait for that, that will. I'd say I'm running live mode, so I don't really care about this publish that's happening in the background. But if I run that, and if I for that to start up as well, it will then build. So while those two things are running, the other thing we get onto is tooling, right? I'm going to jump ahead and talk about SQL Server, Solo, IIS, for example, right? So get this question quite a lot: is how do I connect to my stuff, right? This seems a bit different than what I'm used to. So what we want to do is we grab SQL Server, and then what I want to do is grab from my Docker dashboard. I want to figure out what my SQL instance is. So Helix, SQL examples, and I can be a bit lazy and just grab that. And then I want to log in, and the password, we go back to that .env file and the SQL SA password. That's what we will want to connect with. So push that in there, connect. And as you would expect, like any instance, you're now connected to your Sitecore databases. You can then go ahead and do whatever things that you need to do with that. It's not any different. It's just like connecting to a SQL Azure instance or a SQL Server instance on some other machine. You're not doing anything. It's no different at that point. It's just connecting to a remote machine. You can do something similar with IIS if you really wanted to. You need to connect to the IIS instance, and then either using that entry point script or something else. I have an example in here. So within the startup, there's a enable remote IIS. I can connect to that. Yeah, it's still publishing. So I can give you an example. Let me show you an example of that. So I can connect to my remote, to my Docker container. There's a command called docker container exec, which will then run on this container, run this command, PowerShell. So I can actually look within, I'm now running inside of my container, so I can then go in and see what files are in there. I have a mount called startup. And then within there, I have my scripts that I talked about. So I'm going to go and run that. And then that would, once that's running, that will then allow us to actually connect to my remote IIS instance within the container itself. It's got to download a couple of modules. You do need to install a remote IIS management module. I can't remember off the top of my head what it is, but there is something you need to install on your local instance for that to work. That is run. While that's doing its thing. Okay, so back to that other instance while that's doing its thing. You can see that local instance is now up and running. It's got Helix example site on there, up and running. If I reload this. We'll do a refresh. It's a bit of Sitecore that I hate, waiting for the paint to dry, right? And that did something, no. Okay, so this IIS, while we're still waiting for that, this IIS did the script did install. You can set it to an entry point script if you needed to. Yeah, connect. Too many things happening for my poor machine. Finish. You're not going to want to do this very often, right? But you can you can see that's connected to my remote instance of IIS running inside of the container, and it's got all of the files and Sitecore things that you expect to see in there, right? Don't have too much more. I will just go over a couple of the debugging tools, and then I think we'll almost be done. While we are here, I'll just show you that within the container itself, we have all the Sitecore things. As you'd expect, right? So my local instance doesn't have all of these things in there. Within the container, I do have the Sitecore stuff in there because my base Docker image already had those things built in. When I was building it up, I was extracting out the Sitecore files, I was extracting out the SPE files, I was extracting out the SXA files. All of those things are included in the base image. My local deployment folder is kept extremely clean, and then it's only adding in these things that I'm seeing on top of So once it stops, I go up here, I'll see basic company DLLs have been deployed inside of the container. And finally, the Sitecore instance is up. You can see it's just, I've deployed some code. I've then run this unicorn sync. The items are in the content tree and published as you would expect. no, really, it's not any different than what you would do locally. If I want to do a cleanup, I can just run stop, and I'll show you that in a second. But before that, I'm just going to go over some very quick bits of tooling, right? Jumping around a bit, I showed you the Docker dashboard. This is available from within the system tray. Just right click on it, hit dashboard. This will show you all of your running images, all of your running containers. You can click on each of these things. There's a bunch of logs that you'll be able to take a look at within this window. The logs are copied across in this instance. If you hit inspect, you'll see all the environment variables, Sitecore license file, which I mentioned, a bunch of the mounts that we have set up. So inside the container, outside the container, where that maps to. This will give the full path as opposed to the relative path that we put within our compose file, and also what ports are mounted. And there's a bunch of stats and stuff in here as well, which is quite neat. You can see CPU usage, memory usage, and that kind of stuff. And you can see those for each of the containers. You can start each of the containers as you need as well. If you get an issue within one of those, I mentioned if you've deleted a folder by mistake, just stop it from here, start it from here. It's not a big deal. It will clean itself up. VS Code has a whole bunch of tools in here as well. You can install a Docker extension. It's just the main Docker extension, whatever that is. That will allow you to see all of your running containers. You can then do the logs. You can attach a shell, which is essentially just running that PowerShell command, which I ran earlier, and then gives you a window inside of your container. You can also take a look at things like, all your images and stuff, your registries, networks, volume mounts, etc. Quite useful. So you've got stop, start, remove, pretty much the same as what you can see on the Docker dashboard. And the final one is Visual Studio, right? Because this is where most of us are going to be working within. You go into View, Other Windows, and then Containers. Visual Studio has this nice window set as well. Very similar to what we're already seeing, right? You've got all your running containers, you've got all your environment variables, you can look at the ports, you can look at the logs again, but it also has this nice file browser. So we just done our file browsing via PowerShell. You can go in here and you can see I've got all of the Sitecore files and stuff in here, right? I've got my custom, that's a big one. I've got all of my custom DLLs as well that I deployed in here. It's also quite handy that I can actually go in here, look at my includes, look at my feature. I can also actually open the config files in here as well. I can't edit them, but I can at least view what's been deployed inside the container. Not necessarily just the ones I've deployed, but also the out-of-the-box Sitecore ones, for example. Again, you can also just start, stop, open the terminal window. So the tooling is quite similar. The other one that came up is how do we debug? And debugging is actually, so if for the debug, it's simplest if you're running the latest version of Visual Studio 2019. So 2019 has version 16.5 onwards, has some additional tooling for Docker. So when you select the attacher process, you have an option for the connection type. So Docker Windows container. I can then hit find. That then lists all my Docker containers. So cm. helix examples.local, wait for that to attach, and then that will then show me all of my running processes within the Windows, within the Docker container. So W3P, again, very normal. When you do this, just make sure that the attached to you have managed V3, V6, V4, V5, V4 selected and not automatic. Attach the process, and then it should go ahead, and then you can then just set breakpoints as you would normally for any other project. I'm gonna have to do that one. So now I've gone to the home page. You can hit, and it's now hit my now hit the breakpoint as you would expect, right? I can then go ahead and inspect the variables and or whatever else in that. Again, no different than working locally. I can go ahead and use immediate windows and I can do that, for example, and then just again, it's no different from working on your local machine at this point. And the final one was solar. So show you that. Where is my solar instance? Okay. Again, I can just hit solar. It will just open up. No different. It's just based on whatever the port mapping I had for that solar service within the compose file. Okay, I think we it's about right on time, a little bit over. There's obviously skimmed over a lot of stuff. Hopefully I dove into a little bit of information that's useful. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of blog posts. I've got a few listed here. I really started off this off of Docker, off of the assistance of Mark Cassidy, who'd been diving into it for his own uses and had been screaming about how great this thing was. So have a read of his blog post. Rob Ireland did a presentation at SUGCon on Docker, which goes into a lot more of the theory, which I skipped at the very beginning. And various other community members have really jumped in and got a lot more info. I'll just show you one more thing before we do finish. So I had spoken about cleanup. So just make sure when you're done for the day or whatever, or the next time, just hit start. Just hit close down. I've got a stop script because I hate typing, and stop and tab will autocomplete in this case. That will just bring down my Docker instance. You can see it'll bring that down the containers one by one. While it's doing that. And then the other thing I have was the cleanup script that I talked about. So once that's done. There you go. There we go. So it's gone, it's done, it's taken everything down, but my files are still there. My SQL instance is still here. At this point, I can now run my cleanup script. So you can see it's deleted all my local files, but my databases are still there. I can also run that. And then I've got a completely clean Sitecore instance. I can just go ahead and run start again, and it'll just go ahead and do its thing. It'll create some indexes again, it'll attach a new set of databases, mount through a second, and then hey, I'm up and running. I've got a brand new Sitecore instance. I can run a different client project within the same folder, or I can move on to, if I mess something up on my local instance, I can back to square one. It's no big deal. It's attaching those databases now. So do take a read of these blog posts. Obviously available on Slack and Go as well. Feel free to reach out. There's a lot of information there. Try to capture some of the questions that we were asking ourselves from the very beginning as to how these things work, how these things play together. The sample code, everything you saw is available on GitHub. The start scripts, clean scripts, deploy scripts are all there. Feel free to take them, have a look at them. We've been using them for several months. Makes it super easy to spin up, spin down, review a pull request, resolve and merge conflicts. It's been really nice working with this stuff. Our front-end devs are all using Docker now. None of them work off separate repositories. They work against a running Sitecore instance on the local machine, and using these PowerShell scripts. They don't even need to open Visual Studio. They just pull down the latest, run that deploy script, and they can then continue using VS Code or whatever they want for their front-end stuff. Hopefully you guys have some questions. Something wasn't clear, something that I missed, something that I skimmed over. I know I jumped around on the order of stuff a little bit because of up, down times.
Hello, this is
Ozell. It was so helpful, Jammy.
Hello, Jamie.
Ozell.
Yeah, I have a quick question I wanted to ask. So, in terms of deploying, are you currently using these scripts and everything and deploying containers out to production and running these containers in production, or is this primarily development?
We are only running it for development.
Okay.
We're not running for production. I know some people are running it for production, and it is supported by Sitecore to run in production, I believe. I think the only thing they do ask you is if you have a bug and you need to log a ticket, to just make sure that you can actually replicate it on a non-containerized image, repository, instance. I wouldn't see why not. Yeah, we just aren't running it because obviously we've just been starting out with this. We're running PaaS in production. Definitely in the future, it's something that we would be looking towards now that there's more support, there's more community backing, and there's more understanding for ourselves as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. Great presentation. A lot, like you said, there's a lot in here. Like, I'm looking forward to looking at the deck and watching the video again and trying to dissect, because there's a lot of stuff, but it looks really cool.
Yeah, so do pull down this repo. See if I can pull that up again. If you jump into the Docker folder, all of that stuff is in there, right? Start, restart. The deploy script is in there. So you should be, if you've got your images built, you should be able to just go in and build that directly. Just edit whatever your local version of Windows is, right, to match. And then you'll need to run this set license variable. Just follow what it says on the Docker repo. And then I've added a bunch of a README within this Docker folder itself to kind of explain a bit of the stuff that I went through today. So hopefully that will help you. And if you've got any questions, do just message me on Slack.
Great. Thank you again. Really appreciate it. Great presentation.
Hey, Jamie, I have a question around that .env variable file that you created. That is specific to your script, or is that something available with other action as well?
Yeah, so let me just show you that again.
I didn't see that part of your project. But
Yeah, so the .env file is a Docker thing. It's not something that I've done, right? This .env file is just standard, very standard Docker, right? Same with so this out of the registry with from Sitecore, there already exists a env file in the Windows test 9.3x, for example, it's what you're going to be running. There is an env file in here, right? Obviously, it doesn't come with this because I put that in there. So it'd be something like this.
I think you're not sharing.
You can add your own variables in there if you so wish. You'll want to obviously change these to match whatever version of Sitecore you want, right? So if you're running 9.2, 9.1.1.
Jamie, are you sharing your screen? I'm not seeing it.
Sorry, I didn't hit the share. Sorry.
Okay.
So this is the
okay.
the Docker repo, right? So within Windows tests 9.3, there's this env file, right? You'll obviously want to set these to whatever you want, 9.2, 9.3, whatever else. What I had done in our project is we had extended it with a couple of things. So the project name, if you don't put that in when this starts, this will just match whatever the folder is. So in this case, it would be Docker, but yeah. And then the compose file, it will use Docker compose.yaml by default. Again, this is a standard Docker variable. It's just you can use it or not use it. And then the domain suffix I had added. That's something custom. And what that's doing is with things like the this one on the CM instance here, for example, I've got some network aliases. So it's CM and whatever the domain suffix is. So in our case, it's .helix examples.local. So I can just clone this repo and then for a different project, I can just put that and then I don't have to do lots of edits on my compose file. That's the only reason for adding that, right? But
okay.
You can say you can add your own, you can introduce your own variables. The thing that is custom is this .user file.
Okay.
So this works in conjunction with this start script. And it's just a very simple bit of PowerShell here, right?
Yeah.
It checks if a user file exists. If it does, then when you Docker compose up, use a specific environment file.
I see.
And then in our case, what this is allowing us to do is some of our team members are on 1903, right?
Yeah.
Some are on 1909, some are on 1809, some are on 2004, for example, right?
Yeah.
So that allows us to run, each of us not have to be on the exact same version of Windows. It's a bit of a problem with enterprise clients because they can't upgrade. It's difficult for us to upgrade our local development machine. So that was a reason for that. There is this example here. Some of our team members have more RAM than others. So we've introduced some extra variables. So within our compose file again, you'll see a
yeah, I did see that memory limit.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know where it's set. Okay, so here, for example, Xconnect memory limit, I've set a default of 1 gig. So our env file doesn't have that, so it will use that as the default. Whereas our override file might have, I don't know, if I had a lot of RAM, then I could do that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
That's in that repo as well. It's just more useful in a enterprise type setting where you can't guarantee everyone will be using the exact same settings.
Yeah, I agree. We are in step one, like getting the Docker running. So the next step would be all this ensuring the volatile things are taken care. And I believe once you start sharing with the team, that's when you end up with this kind of scenarios.
Yeah,
Very
different team
issues.
members, different clients, right? That's
Yeah.
probably that's where our issue is with different clients. But yeah, just be careful with the out of the box one, compose files, like the one here, the SPE one that's not an out of the box one. Okay, so the out of the box one, so XP, SPE, for example, like the CM, for example, has no volume mounts defined by default. So you can get a Sitecore instance up, but you can't deploy anything to it. So these are kind of one of the other things that you'll have to watch out for when you're starting. But if you have an issue with it, just clone this Helix examples repo and try running that. Should give you a good starting point, hopefully.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, you can use these variables to your advantage as well. For our SQL instance, for example, I have a variable within the folder name here, and what that allows me to do is set a thing like this, DB instance. So for all practical purposes, what it's doing is it's taking this and it replaces that like so.
Okay.
And then I can essentially have a different set of databases running. So I'm gonna have to spin down. But that again is super useful. I can be working on something and then set this variable, and then say something comes up. I got to do a bug fix. I got to do a pull request, a review of some code from somebody else, but I don't want to trash the thing I'm working on because I'm halfway through. I can then just set this variable within that environment user file. With it, yeah. Spin back up again. So spin that up. Wait for that, and it will attach a brand new clean set of databases. And I can keep switching between both of them at this point, right?
Yeah.
Code, I don't really care, right? I don't really care about code so much. I can delete and redeploy. It's items and things which I usually care about more, and not having to resync all my unicorn data.
Yep.
That's the usual thing that I'm a little bit more wary about time safe. So there's some nice things you can do around that. That's been a bit of a godsend for reviewing code and pull requests and that kind of stuff. And also for checking your own code, right? So if I synced to Unicorn and then a team member's complained that I missed something in the check-in, some items or something, I can switch database, sync up from scratch, and see what it's doing.
Yeah, that's a common problem we see.
Yeah. Did I bring up the SPE one again? I think I had that mounted.
Yeah, meantime, anybody else have any questions?
Hey, Jamie, it was good to know that I can log in the same SQL in the in our local SQL, and also the Visual Studio, the containers one was new to me.
Yeah, just make sure you got Visual Studio 2019. You can do it using 2017, but there's a few extra steps that it's just not worth it, right? So yeah, this was like one of the main questions I had is like, but it's inside the Docker container. How do I get to this, and how do I get to that, and how does a file deploys work? It doesn't make sense. But once you say, okay, it's kind of just like running. It's almost as if I was deploying into an Azure VM working from my local machine. If you think of it that way, then you're like, okay, it's just a remote thing that I got to connect into.
Got it. Got it. That totally makes sense.
Yeah.
And I believe in a regular instance, you need to install that remote, what do you call the Visual Studio remote debugging tool or something.
Yeah. Yes, you do. Yeah, you gotta put it through a mount. It's
We still
if
do
you put
that?
it into if you put it into a specific mount, it will attach it automatically on startup. With Visual Studio 2019, what it does is when I go and attach, Visual Studio and Docker kind of work together and recognize that I've attached, and it actually does attach the debugger. It actually does download and attach the debugger, remote debugger inside the container instance. So it is doing that, but it's doing it automatically rather than you having to worry about it. If you don't do that, you will have to add mounts everywhere. So if I want to debug this, I'll have to install the remote debugger locally and attach, and then add a mount to that debugger within here, and then the development entry point script will pick that up and then run the remote debugger code. So it's a bit more involved, and then when you go to actually debug, there is no obviously there's no Docker connection type here. You'll have to figure out what the IP address is of the Docker instance, or put the Docker name in, and then do a bunch of stuff. So it's just,
I think this is much easier, and
just don't bother. Download Visual Studio 2019. Make sure you're running 16.5 upwards. Just make sure you've got the latest updates installed, and this will give you things like this container window as well, right? A lot of us are quite visual, so you can at least go in and look at the files and see what's deployed, where things are, how it's doing copies, and that kind of stuff. It's just the download the modern tooling. It's going to save you a lot of heartache.
A couple of things I want to highlight is one is related to that containerization technology that you set it up to default it as Linux when you install it. You just need to switch it to Windows container. That is something I faced an issue in the Docker desktop in the taskbar. If you right click, you get an option where it says Windows container or Linux container. So when you install Docker, by default it is Linux. So the first thing we need to change it to Windows container before doing anything.
Yeah, so if you just right click here, it's a bit small. It says switch to Linux containers, Linux containers. If you're on Windows, it will say switch to Linux. If you're on Linux, which is the default, it will say switch to Windows. So yeah, just make sure you've selected that initially.
Yeah, and another thing I faced is related to the build PS1. I need to set the mode to process, or like where you showed process that I need to.
The screen again. Sorry, I was just showing the screen again. This command down here.
Yeah.
Switch to Linux and switch to Windows.
And another thing which did not let me build the build PS1 was the process mode or something in the build PS1, or you showed it in the env variable or like .env file, I think. Mode equal to process or something like that.
Yeah, there is a
Yeah, for me, force Hyper-V did not work. I have to go with force process to work.
Yeah.